I want to welcome you this evening. My name is Elizabeth Wood. I'm the Director of Advancement at the Rhode Island Historical Society. If you're a member of RIHS, I thank you for your support and feel free to reach out to me if you should have any questions about your membership or the benefits of membership. And if you're not a member, please consider joining. Membership carries many benefits, and although this year has been unusual, next year we're looking forward to lots of activities, including free concerts, special events, exclusive programming, and more. So tonight's program, From Mayhem to Mistletoe, offers a lighthearted look at the vast array of winter celebrations with Executive Director Morgan Greffe. Morgan is a historian by training and Executive Director at the Rhode Island Historical Society, but this was not the topic of her dissertation, but a happy circumstance. We do have time for questions at the end of this program, so if you could use the raise your hand feature, we will unmute you so that you may ask your question directly. So without any further ado, welcome, Morgan.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome. Welcome to Rumtucket. It's so wonderful to see you. We have a very small house, so normally we can't have so many people over for Christmas. So we are particularly excited to have you with us today, and a special welcome to my Aunt Jane, who I see here in the audience, and to my dear old dad, who is also here. He goes by the pseudonym tonight of Miriam Rodriguez. And so wanted to welcome them. And so I'm going to be showing you a presentation, which hopefully you will be able to see. If there are any problems with advancing of the slides, please put it in the chat. Chris is here to help us as we move forward through the presentation. So I will be talking to you tonight, and you can put questions in the chat bar while we go so you don't forget questions you might have. And then at the end of the talk, you can either raise your hand and ask questions or put them in the chat and Chris will read them to me. So what you see right now, or should see, is Christmas at the John Brown House Museum from 1994. When I came to the Historical Society in 2005, there were a lot of questions about whether or not we were going to be decorating for the holiday. And in fact, we have chosen not to since the 1990s. And that was for a couple reasons. One was that it's not really safe around the artifacts to have live plants and to have decorations and people so close to our objects, but also because in fact, in looking at the Browns in the 1790s, which is what we interpret the building to, they really wouldn't have been decorating in this way. So it began a conversation with our docents and with our staff about what would Christmas have looked like. And so we started gathering together some ideas, some images, and that is sort of the beginning and origins for this talk. And so today we're going to begin by looking at some of those earliest winter revelries and where we get some of our notions of Christmas today. And we're going to move up really up until the end of the 19th century. And as Liz said, this is more of a romp than it is a deep historical analysis. So I'm looking forward to entertaining you a little bit and learning from you if you have some things to share. So we're going to begin quite some time ago and quite far away with the Festival of Saturnalia. I'm sure that many of you know and have heard of the fact that our Christmas celebrations have much to do with kind of their pagan origins. It was the Emperor Constantine who's credited with bringing Christianity to the Roman Empire and in fact built the Vatican atop the hill in Rome. This hill, in fact, was also where worshipers would gather to worship the sun, especially on the solstice. And this was around what is now Christmas, so December 25th on our calendar. So Saturnalia became not just a one-day celebration, but weeks of a fairly raucous affair. So feasting, drinking, taking to the streets. It was also a time during which people would decorate their houses with pine boughs as symbols of life. Candles would be put out to serve as ornaments, light being a really important factor in these celebrations in the middle of winter. So Saturnalia marks the darkest moment of the year, and therefore that focus on the candle and on light became all the more important. So why is it then that this Christian emperor would decide to put this holy day in the middle of a pagan feast and festival? And scholars have pretty much come down on pretty strongly on one theory, which is you don't make a lot of friends by getting rid of a holiday. And so he realized that by getting rid of something that was a core feature of their community, of their celebrations, getting rid of that would be really disruptive and would not win any support for his move towards Christianity, but also for them embracing this new holiday of Christmas. And in fact, he was hoping that these pagan rituals would morph and change. And Christmas was widely celebrated through the Roman Empire by the middle of the 4th century. And it was also celebrated in Egypt. So again, what did this look like? There's no stockings hung by the chimney with care. And so what they're doing, and as scholars of this period think about, is when they make that comparison between Saturnalia and Christmas, is often they go from worshiping the sun god to the son of God. And so they make these kind of direct connections for people. So it's easy for them to make this adjustment. So the festival ranges from December 17th to about the 23rd. And it ends in the Deus Natalis Solis Invicti, or the birthday of the unconquerable sun. And these 3 days, there were 3 days that were legal holidays. So no schools met, no gymnasia was held, no courts were held, and no wars were to be waged during this time. And one of the interesting points about Saturnalia is there is no actual full kind of firsthand account of it. So everything that scholars know about it has been really pieced together. Other highlights of this celebration was a focus on holly. Holly is considered sacred to Saturn and often associated with the two. So sprigs of holly were considered important gifts during that time, as were small figurines. And some scholars say that those figurines are actually toys for children, and it's the origin of giving children toys, which it may be. Others have focused in on the use of figurines as stand-ins for human sacrifice. I leave it up to you which you choose to focus in on this holiday season. And one of the other features of Saturnalia was that it was a time of role reversal. So opposite was of normal was acceptable. So for instance, during Saturnalia, gambling was permitted in public. Stakes could be coins, or nuts were frequently used in gambling. Overeating and drunkenness was common, as was disguising oneself. And frequently in this opposite feature, you had the reversal of roles for masters and slaves. And so traditionally, masters would serve the slaves a meal of the sort that they would not usually enjoy. And that slaves were given liberty to insult their masters without fear of retribution. Citizens or slaves might be elected the king of Saturnalia at a banquet, which at that time they could give absurd orders that had to be obeyed. So as you're listening to this, and when I first was reading about Saturnalia, it really was quite reminiscent to me of what we know about Twelfth Night. And so we're fast forwarding here hundreds of years to think about what this Christmas period looked like in jolly old England. And many of our notions about Christmas are actually constructions of the 19th century, which we'll be talking about later. At this time in the 19th century, things were becoming much more regimented and orderly. And we know that in this period, there was also the sort of downright fabrication of the past. And so our notions of Christmas are impacted by that, when in reality, Christmas was celebrated in a way that looked not just like Saturnalia, but in many ways much more of what we think of how we think Halloween is celebrated. So in the early 17th century, there were many holy days, on the calendar. They were listed in almanacs, often in red, and so we think of red letter days. And in these kind of feudal times when people were working off the land, used to taking a break in December. This is, again, the darkest period of the year. And by the 17th century, these moments had been clearly marked as, by Christian holidays. And one of the ways during this period that Christmas was most frequently celebrated was, again, by the inversion of wealth and power. We see this in England with the tradition of wassailing. And so I'm sure many of you are familiar with wassailing. We think of carolers as a lovely addition to our Christmas season. But in the 17th century, groups of lower class men would arrive at the homes of their betters and demand money, drinks, food, and they would be, for using our term, singing for their suppers. They really truly would not leave before they got some money or food or otherwise. If not paid, the wassailers would often become verbally abusive and would even physically attack the homes and the people in the homes. So similar to Halloween, as I mentioned, this is really a period where people thought of a lesser, or children in the case of Halloween could go to a stranger's home and demand something just for the act of showing up and asking for it. Cross-dressing was also very frequent occurrence during this period. And it was a frequent trope of this period, very similar to what we saw in Saturnalia, was a peasant would sometimes be named the Lord of Misrule. So students would also, what they called, bar out their teachers, meaning that they would basically take over the school building with force until the teacher relented in giving them a few days, sometimes even up to 2 weeks off for the winter holiday. Another tradition that in many ways has continued in our Christmas celebrations is the tipping of servants. So servants would collect money in clay boxes in England in this period. There was a slit in the top, and it became known as Christmas boxing, and then simply as boxing. So we know that in England and Canada, we still celebrate Boxing Day, and this has to do with that tradition of tipping servants. There was also the less family-oriented active gangs that would dress in costume and parade up and down the streets, shouting, caroling, singing, playing instruments, and generally disturbing the peace. We'll see this a little bit later, but this is often referred to as frolicking or mumming. And that mumming tradition particularly takes root in the Delaware Valley when they come to the New World, much more so than in New England. But one of the things that's quite clear here is that Christmas is in this period a very public holiday. It is not a home-based holiday, other than that you're going into others' homes demanding things. It is a very outwardly facing, frolicsome sort of holiday. And there was not much very religious about this period at all. Christmas was not by any means seen as a sort of high holy day in the way that Easter would be. So we're still celebrating this kind of raucous Christmas in England and in Europe, but we want to now travel over to our home in, let's see, in New England. Are we on the right slide, Chris? Okay. So perhaps you've heard that Christmas was actually illegal in Puritan Massachusetts. In fact, that is true. But even before making it illegal in 1659, Christmas was a highly contentious issue. We know from written records that pilgrims arrived in December 1620, and they spent December 25th of that year building a community storehouse. So that's the first recorded Puritan Christmas. In later years, non-Puritans in the colony, for those of you who don't know, there were a number of non-Puritans who actually came over in that period as well and lived within these Puritan-based communities. In later years, non-Puritans in the colony would ask Increase Mather for permission to have Christmas Day off, as they would have had in their homelands. He agreed, but when he caught them playing ball in the streets, he said that he would punish them if they did not stop playing and at least spend the day in quiet contemplation. It was Cotton Mather who would make it even clearer why he felt there was no need to celebrate on December 25th. Just as Oliver Cromwell would legislate in England, the Bible only makes one day holy, and that's the Sabbath. In the British Empire and the Puritan colonies, almanacs were purged of red letter days in this period, including Christmas. This seems antithetical to those of us for whom Christmas is so fundamental, but the Puritans had good reason to support the eradication of the holiday. One, the celebration of any birthdays was seen as heathen within the Puritan faith. And the Puritan faith at this point is really what we think of. The Puritans were largely Congregationalists, or as we call them now, Congregationalists, and then Unitarian Universalists. And two, the Bible never actually notes what day Jesus was born. Scholars and philosophers have been trying to figure this out for a long time. There's a lot of bets in April and May, a couple for November, but none really for December 25th. And so Cotton Mather, who I wouldn't say that I think of Cotton Mather as a real funny guy, like not a real jokester, but in an attempt, I think, at humor, he says, if Jesus had wanted us to celebrate his birthday, he certainly would have let us know when it was. And so, I mean, this is puritanical humor. I can't make this up. And of course, there's the fact that if Christmas was supposed to be a Christian holiday, then if we were mandated to celebrate this, the Puritans argued, then certainly wassailing, mumming, and these very public celebrations were not the way in which they would celebrate it. So thinking back to that sort of merry old England picture we do have an example from Salem, Massachusetts, of what people were concerned about with this holiday. At approximately 9 o'clock on Christmas night in 1679, 4 young men entered the house of a 72-year-old Salem farmer named John Rowden. Rowden, it turns out, was famous for making a delicious pear wine called perry. The 4 young men came into the house and sat by the fire and began to sing. They asked for a cup of perry. When Rowden refused, the men got angry. They began demanding, but Rowden and his wife insisted that they would not be served at their house. The young men left, only to return 15 minutes later, saying that they had borrowed money and could pay for the perry. But it turned out that the money was only pieces of lead, and Rowden and his apprentice pushed the men out of the house. The young men then stood about 40 feet away from the Rowden house, screaming and taunting them and trying to get them to come out to fight. The young men proceeded to throw stones, bones, and various things that they found at the house, broke his fence, broke into his cellar, and stole some apples. So this is not exactly the kind of Christmas of yore that we like to think about and remember for New England. Over in England in the same time, Oliver Cromwell, as I mentioned, has removed Christmas from the calendar. And in fact, during this Christmas-less reign, if you will, Cromwell introduces a monthly day of fasting. And in the first year, he makes that monthly day of fasting December 25th. And later, he would insist that Parliament would actually meet throughout all of the 12 days of Christmas. So he really is taking a strong stance here. And it's important for us to remember, of course, the Puritans, even the separatists, are English in this period. And many of them are very much seeing themselves in that way. So by the 18th century, holidays, including Christmas, were making their way back into the almanacs. And as did a little bit more of the gaudiness. So we see some of the puritanical structure breaking down a little bit. And we often see in print this taking the form of holiday poetry. So one example, New England example, was Christmas is a coming, boys. We'll go to Mother Chase's, and there we'll get some sugar drams sweetened with molasses. Seems fairly tame. So sugar dram is rum. But I think my personal favorite, what is listed as a Christmas poem, is also from Massachusetts, which is, "Hi-ho for our Cape Cod, hi-ho for Nantasket. Do not let the Boston wags feel your oyster basket." So again, not really that beautiful, quaint New England Christmas that we have constructed. By 1730, Christmas was becoming an almost respectable holiday with the continual assertion of the Nativity of Christ. So there is a concerted effort on the part um, of, of people publishing books, newspapers, to really focus in on the Christian aspect of this holiday. What people wanted to do was to make the religious aspects of the holiday more of a focal point. By 1733, with Christmas back in the almanacs, poems began to be included about not drinking to excess. So they're starting to tell people what Christmas should look like, when in fact it's never what Christmas looked like before. So we can see this again in taking shape in the 18th century. Cotton Mather's noting of the fact that if Christmas should be a holiday, that it should be marked in a Christian and restrained manner, was starting to gain popularity. So now public figures, often those doing printing, really focused on the cause of cheer, not excess cheer. By 1760, it was the exception rather than the rule to omit Christmas from calendars and almanacs. I went to the Providence Gazette to see where and how Christmas was mentioned in the years when the Browns were moving into their house in 1788. And this is actually a poem that I found. And coincidentally, it was on the same microfilm reel as a very discreet wedding announcement for John Francis and Abby Brown, John Brown's oldest daughter. And so in this poem, which I know is a little hard to read, we start to hear much more of what we think of as a familiar refrain. Things like some of the stanzas, and shall no anthem from the muse arise to hail the day that gave our Savior birth, whose mandate tiered the star-spangled skies, filled the vast main and clothed the lamenting earth. Perish the thought, methinks I hear the choir of angelic harping on 10,000 strings, while their breasts glow with pure sapphiric fire, and listening ethers with music ring. And so now we're very much in that sort of spirit of the Savior's birth, of angels, of choirs singing, and it's starting to look like the Christmas that we are supposed to know. So even though at this point, people are, like, even the Congregationalists are celebrating the holiday, there was still much debate over the intemperance of the day. There was too much drinking, there was too much eating. In the 1760s, Boston news carriers started to get into the game and really push the tipping aspect of the holiday again as part of the public sentiment. So, right, we see that they're trying to get rid of this excess, but they are in fact bringing back some of the other aspects of it. So the Boston newspapers in the 1760s would publish what they called the carrier's address, and it asked for patrons to give the carriers a tip of a few shillings. So this is a continuation of these boxing traditions, and they also would publish these tipping or addresses from other factions within the city. So one that they published said, "This is unto all the gentlemen who shoes here. I wish you a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. For shoeing your horses and trimming their locks, please remember my New Year's box." And so we see here's a young man tending to horses, working at a stable of some kind. And we see this New Year's box or Christmas box being featured here in the Boston area. And we still see here that it is not a day. This is a Christmas season. And so it is much of December, not yet the sort of what we think of with Advent. So not the religious aspect, but much more the 12 days aspect of from Christmas to just after New Year's, kind of the Epiphany. But this new religious emphasis still did not make Christmas Day what it is now for us. In fact, other than the newspaper stating it and more churches holding mass on that day, not much is changing. Not until that is a small group of New Yorkers decide that we need some new holidays. as a way to curtail the encroachment of new immigrant communities. Now, this is a story I particularly like because it centers on how important historical societies are. And so it's particularly attractive to me. And we all know that our colonies were never as homogeneous as we think. And in fact, you're thinking about 17th century New Amsterdam, about 500 residents speaking upwards of 18 languages. So New Amsterdam is a particularly ethnically and linguistically diverse colony. And it's growing ever more so in the 19th century. So the new nation is really becoming this growing patchwork. And New York is the site of so much of that economic growth and ethnic pluralism that we see. And the island of Manhattan in 1800, while crisscrossed at its tip with winding streets like Boston, was still fairly rural at its geographic core. And much of this land was divided up into gigantic family estates of the extraordinarily wealthy. Sadly, we know that when people feel threatened, have their status threatened in any way, as the upper class members of New York felt in the beginning of the 19th century, they often look for ways to exert their superiority, to entrench themselves in history, to solidify their place, and to codify the sense of belonging and their ownership of the culture of that community and their identity being the original right of that area. In the early 19th century, with all of these forces acting upon Americans and this growth of pluralism, there was a sense among people of wanting to create uniquely American history, uniquely American traditions. Now, this is not just, and so this was a growing sense of a generalized sense of Christianity and Puritanism. So we're going from the 17th century, where the differences between, let's say, a Congregationalist and a Unitarian Universalist are vast and of fundamental importance. The difference between Congregationalists and Baptists are huge divides. We're seeing in the 19th century that a lot of that Protestantism is becoming leveled out in terms of their differences. And we're seeing a sort of idea that they are Protestant with the capital P. And as those differences were lessening a bit, and conceptions of God were, as many argued, they were going through these transitions, people started to assert their position within history and creating that history through the creation of historical societies. As many of you know, the RHS was formed in 1822, 200th coming up, and we're the fourth oldest in the country. So the earliest here, we're looking at New York. And in 1804, a man named John Pintard helped to form the New York Historical Society. Pintard was part of a burgeoning middle class. He was well situated, not as wealthy as his friends, but he had the right friends. And he had what theorists call cultural capital. He had a good education, he was of good stock, he had the right friends. So in 1804, he forms the New York Historical Society, and in 1810, he helped to create, or some would say invent, a tradition. Pintard, like many of his coterie, felt that there simply were not enough American holidays. Other countries in Europe had saints' days, traditional harvest days, and historical holidays. The United States only had the 4th of July, New Year's, and locally determined Thanksgivings. So we only had 3 holidays, and that didn't seem like nearly enough to help cement identity. So Pintard's quest for more holidays was also met with his desire to clarify the practices of the Christmas holiday season. New York was getting more crowded and rowdier, and Pintard and his friends did not approve. Nor, as we know from his writing, did he really know what to do on the holiday himself. He wasn't sure if he should visit people, wait until New Year's, have multiple feasts, quietly contemplate. What should a respectable man do to celebrate the holiday season? So he decided to create a tradition. So we know that he felt distinctly that he had to do something here in New York that was different from New England, which was, he was saying, had the real American history. And so he looked to New York's Dutch history, which is what he felt was a differentiator from New England's history. And he looked to St. Nicholas Day, which is December 6th. St. Nicholas was the children's bishop, and in 1810, Pintard hosted the New York Historical Society's annual meeting on that day, and their broadside announcing their annual meeting was of St. Nicholas. So this is, as you know, in America, the first major celebration of St. Nicholas Day is the New York Historical Society. So again, if you have any suggestions for new holidays for Rhode Island, let us know. We are interested in using our power and influence for good. And as you can see, it didn't take long for St. Nicholas to change. You know, St. Nicholas doesn't look much like the Santa Claus that we imagined. You can see him here on the previous page. He looks a lot like a bishop. He doesn't look like the Saint Nick we know and love, but within just a couple of years, he gains the beard, he gains the fur cloak, and he starts to get the trappings of the Saint Nick we know. But St. Nicholas Day is also a little bit different. It makes a lot of sense at first glance. You think that New Amsterdam's heritage is Dutch, and so why not? But it was Dutch Protestants who colonized New York, not Dutch Catholics. In fact, some would say they're the same people the Protestants were trying to get away from. And St. Nicholas Day was really only celebrated by Dutch Catholics in this period. Children were given, in fact, the traditional present was small religious icons. Religious icons really not a hugely popular 17th century Protestant gift. So Pintard's work falls into this category of the invention of tradition. It is not so much that he made up St. Nick, but he co-opted a pre-existing holiday and infused it with ideas of his own. Dutch children left their shoes by the hearth for gifts. And in his first images, the first known image of St. Nick, we can see stockings that are hung by the chimney. So we can see them picking and choosing and creating this American view of Christmas. One of the main differences was really that it was St. Nick's reaction to badly behaved children. Like the Christmas traditions we think of, St. Nick would reward good children with shoes or stockings filled with oranges, candy, and little trinkets. Bad children, however, did not receive a lump of coal in this period. Instead, their parents were left a birchen rod with which to beat their children. So again, something that's generally fallen out of favor. Scholar Stephen Nissenbaum has argued that St. Nicholas Day, at least in the Netherlands, functioned as a mini, or what they call the Children's Judgment Day. So following his train of thought, St. Nicholas Day was a way to introduce children of their religious duties, about what rules you're supposed to follow and what happens, the rewards if you follow those rules, and the punishment if you don't. Pintard did not have to do all of this work alone. There was an informal group of dubbed the Knickerbockers, who made Christmas one of their special projects. Washington Irving was one of these men, and he wrote much of his sketchbook while seated at a table at the New York Historical Society. While many of his works at the time were New York stories, he also included one about England called Bracebridge Hall. It was a fictional account of a country gentleman who's trying to instill better manners in country folk by celebrating Christmas in the proper old-fashioned way. Of course, the old-fashioned way is entirely new. And Irving's writings of these tales, in fact, is instructing people on how to celebrate this new holiday. He is quite blatant about his intention, and he is stating that this is how one properly would celebrate Christmas in this colony or in this state. One of the primary differences between Christmas as it was and the Christmas that Irving portrayed it, and as the Knickerbockers wanted it to be, was that, as we said before, Christmas before had been this very public event of parading, mumming, wassailing, visiting. Now Christmas was supposed to be an almost totally indoor holiday, a day for family with children at its center. Childhood, of course, becoming a real prominent feature of the growing idea of the middle class. And if children are good, they would receive things like toys, books, and candies, especially sugar candies. And as soon as Christmas was a family-based holiday, it became a consumer-driven holiday. So one of the big cautions when we look at the gross commercialization of Christmas today is to know that people have been complaining about the gross commercialization of Christmas since it became a holiday as we know it. So in fact, complaining about gross commercialization is as much a Christmas tradition as Christmas itself. So it has been part and parcel of this concept from its beginning. So we've now seen the role that Pinchard, the New York Historical Society, and Washington Irving played in creating Christmas, but we haven't even gotten to the big guns. And that is a man with an important Rhode Island connection, Clemency Moore. We know that Clemency Moore spent his summers in Newport, so he has this Rhode Island tie, but he was also one of the wealthiest men in New York City. His father was the Episcopal Bishop of New York for 35 years. And while Clement Moore was a lay person, he founded and taught at an Episcopal seminary. And he was very conservative, as was his family. Moore lived on his mother's family estate on was then the northern edge of New York City. So I mentioned before that estates were rather large, and they often were named as they were in England. So to give you a sense of the size of his family's estate, the name of the estate was Chelsea. And so the entirety of what Chelsea is now, from about 19th to 24th Street and between 8th and 10th Avenue, was where Clemency Moore called home. It was in the 18 teens that city planners of New York were expanding the city grid plan and were encroaching upon Chelsea. It was not long before much of his estate was taken by eminent domain. He was not pleased with the new face of New York City and assertions of tradition and home-based holidays he thought would help promote the sense of what he wanted New York and what he wanted America to be. So it was Moore who penned the poem, only really popular in New York at the time, first published actually in Troy, New York, strangely enough, but that would become the iconic Christmas poem of A Visit from St. Nick. So I won't read it to you here now. We all know that 'twas the night before Christmas, but we start to see here again this emphasis on things that we think of, right, as Christmas, the sugar plums, but also the crest of the new fallen snow and that white Christmas idea. Moore really is responsible for putting that together and presenting it for one of the first times as Christmas as a whole trope. So it wasn't just the English and the Dutch who were here, and I want to spend a little bit of time talking about a group that was perhaps the most influential in our concepts of how we celebrate Christmas, and that's the German population. So 40 to 50 million Americans say that their largest ethnicity of origin is German. That is the largest group in America. I think in New England, sometimes it's easy to lose sight of that. But in fact, German immigration, about 7 million Germans who came to the United States, starting in mostly around the 1840s, though some here far earlier than that. But in that 19th century moment and into the 20th century, the German population brought many of their traditions that took root in our communities and have grown and changed over the years. And I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about them because they're particularly colorful. So we see here what we call the Pelznickel, or St. Nicholas in fur, often called the Belsnickel. So the Belsnickel is how it is more frequently said these days. And like jolly old St. Nick, men used to dress up like the Belsnickel. We can see a wonderful, terrifying example on your screen right now. But there's no sort of tummy bowl full of jelly here. The figure was generally tall and thin and dressed like a deranged German patrician. with a long blonde wig, a long pointy yellow beard, but with a darkened face as part of the disguise. The Belsnickels would travel around the town, often in groups of about 6, and with presents, as you can see in his sack, and a whip or a rod. They'd give some children small gifts, usually food, striking other children. They didn't necessarily have time to interview who was good or bad, so, things happen. There were sometimes mistakes, and some Belsnickels were apparently a bit overzealous in their punishments. But it was permissible for a Belsnickel to enter another person's home and, in fact, hit other people's children. And so sometimes the Belsnickels also took the role of wassailers and mummers, expecting to be paid for their performances on those evenings. And on at least one occasion, it caused a large Belsnickel riot in Germany, not here in the US. The Belsnickel in some areas was also called the Kris Kringle. And so again, we see pieces of this that work their way into our popular culture. So the Belsnickel idea in the US didn't stay much past the Civil War. So we saw it here in the sort of 1840s and 50s, but not much longer than that. But one of the things that stuck around out of this same sort of tradition was the disguise and the parading through the streets. And that is something for those of you, and I know we've got some Philadelphians around and those from the Delaware Valley, morphed into and became the Mummers and the Mummers Parade, which is still held on New Year's Day in Philadelphia and is huge. And so we can see, again, these bits of our popular culture that have their roots in the ethnic origins of other parts of our communities. One of the other popular German Christmas traditions is the Krampus, who has had a bit of a revival in years recently. So December 5th is, and Sylvia Reese is here on the Zoom tonight, so she can correct all of my German. So please forgive me for all of my mispronunciation. But December 5th is Krampusnacht, when the Krampus reigns. So in the real world, people might have attended Krampus balls, or young men from a local Krampus group might don carved wooden masks of the Krampus, carry cowbells, chains, and elaborate costumes to run through the town in a Krampuslauf or Krampus run, frightening and sometimes, again, beating bystanders. I am, no pun intended, struck by the number of Christmas traditions that involve beating people. So I just find that an entertaining aspect to the holiday. According to legend, Krampus would spend the night visiting each house. He might leave bundles of sticks for bad children, or he might just hit them with sticks instead. He might toss the children into a sack or a basket and throw them on his back and then throw them in a river. I mean, why not? It's the holiday. The next day, though, is St. Nicholas's Day. And so, again, there's a lot of meshing of these traditions in Europe. And so you have Krampusnacht, and so you have this question of who was good, who was bad. And then on St. Nicholas Day, whether or not you're going to get your presents. So again, we see how these things fit together. And the Krampus legend, the Krampus of legend whips people with this birch bundle, and he is a literal demon. But whether or not this was really enacted in the streets has often been debated. But in fact, there is a description from Salzburg of one of the actual Krampus incidents, and said the narrow streets in the old city section of Salzburg were packed with pedestrians as the Krampus stomped through. Many people were caught unaware and reacted with terror. Some would flee and try to seek refuge in shops and restaurants, only to be pursued by a determined Krampus. With so many easy targets, we again managed to escape largely unharmed. At times we were chased, jostled, and struck, but compared with the brutality we witnessed, it was obvious that we had been spared the full brunt of what the Krampus could master. So you can see that this is these savage beatings, and they were often the thighs and the shins. So it was really a leg-based beating. And one of the things that's interesting here when we think about the Krampus itself, he becomes a fixture on Austrian holiday greeting cards. So it's really not Germany, but Austria that makes him visually an important part of this Christmas season. And one of the defining characteristics is as you can see, is having one human foot and one hoof. So that is a feature of the Krampus. So now you know. And the Krampus is used, as we might imagine, as a way to make sure that children are behaving themselves. And in fact, some Austrian households had year-round Krampus decor to remind children to stay good, or the Krampus would get them. So sort of like the terrifying version of Elf on the Shelf. Again, now Krampus is a big part of our folk art. And as I said, in the last couple of years has made a comeback. And just for fun, I thought I'd share with you a holiday card that we've had here that we use, and my darling husband made of our cats featured in an Austrian Krampus card from the 19th century. So we know he's come back to as a popular favorite. So the Germans didn't only just bring with them the horror of the Belsnickel and the Krampus, they also brought us some of our most enduring features that we see. So perhaps the greatest tradition to have come from Germany is that of the Christmas trees, and not quite in the direct route that you might think. It seems that up through at least the 18th century, Christmas trees were only really notable in the Alsace region of Germany. They were often very small tabletop trees, which we've pictured here. We can't be sure of when the first ones were really put up in American homes, but it seems like the first ones to be seen in print and to be shared widely is the Christmas tree of the German immigrant Charles Follen. Born Karl Follen, this man was the German equivalent of Clement Moore. He was a member of the elite and educated class. As a university student, Follen, this is where he differentiates himself from Clement C. Moore. He penned a political song in support of the emerging liberal nationalist movement and was arrested for complicity in a political murder. So again, slight divergence. But he was acquitted, and he became a faculty member at the University of Jena. He continued his political actions and was in fact exiled from Germany. He moved to Switzerland, gained another faculty appointment, and was soon accused of forming a revolutionary cell and was forced to flee again. This time he fled to the United States with a letter of introduction from an aging Marquis de Lafayette. He arrived in New York and soon met Catherine Sedgwick, writer of the novel Redwood, a book that Follen had in fact read. Sedgwick, a Massachusetts woman by birth, introduced Follen to his friend Eliza Cabot of Boston. And Follen and Cabot were married just 2 years later. Follen loved the American Republican ideals and quickly became an active and vocal Unitarian. Soon he became the confidant of William Lloyd Garrison and helped to build the New England Anti-Slavery Society. Follen took jobs as a private tutor, but his principles kept him from taking another faculty position. Thanks to Follen's Unitarian ties, he met a British woman who was traveling in the United States named Harriet Martineau, and she was publishing her travel accounts as she went through the United States. She visited Martineau visited the Follens at Christmas time, where he had put up a tree. And Martineau actually reported on it and shared it, and the story was shared nationally. Soon, Catherine Sedgwick would write her own story called New Year's Day, and she includes a similar Christmas tree in her story. Within only a few years, Christmas trees became a focal point of this child-based celebration. So it was really, again, the role of the media in introducing people to this idea of the Christmas tree, and it just took off from there. And it was helped along the way by other authors who, in many ways, again, cement this idea of Christmas in our mind and what you're supposed to do on Christmas. So yes, authors are writing poems about Christmas, and they're helping people decide how to celebrate their holidays. And books are often considered some of the best Christmas gifts. So books are being written around New Year's and Christmas themes. But besides A Visit from St. Nick, A Christmas Carol becomes, of course, the most popular Christmas story of this time. Dickens' story doesn't just set up the evil Christmas-hating character Scrooge, but he helps to push the idea of the noble Christmas charity. And that's really the theme that Dickens is presenting. So Christmas reform in Dickens' period, unlike the earlier part of the 19th century, was being pursued by liberal activists. They're focusing on, it's the focus of education reformers, abolitionists, children's aid societies. And Dickens is a huge promoter of these ideas. So he is very self-consciously in 1842 and 43 writing stories that center charitable giving and helping the poor as the central tenet of how to celebrate Christmas the way it's supposed to be. And like Washington Irving, he's using the same sort of idea of, well, this is how it was in the old days, which is, of course, as we've talked about this whole time, a complete fabrication of what the old days were. So again, just a wonderful image from this illustrated Christmas Carol. Fun fact, in my first play I was ever in the 4th grade, they decided to make me this character, the Ghost of Christmas Present. It's the perfect role for a really scrappy 9-year-old. But I had a great cloak, so that made up for everything. So our mid-19th century ideas are really being shaped by these authors who are setting forth a cultural and social agenda. But it is not until 1852, 9 years after Dickens publishes his Christmas novella and 10 years after our Constitution was created in Rhode Island, that the law also authorizes Christmas as a holiday. This is the same year in which 4th of July and Thanksgiving, well, actually 4th of July becomes a holiday, and Thanksgiving, they say, will be recognized when it becomes a federal holiday. And so 1852 is the first time that in Rhode Island, they say, okay, this is a holiday for everyone, you have off. And what I love most is that in the Providence Journal in 1852, they actually published an explanation of what Christmas is, with one of my favorite first lines. This is a day kept by Episcopalians and some other denominations of Christians in commemoration of the birth of Jesus Christ, an event which proclaimed peace on earth and salvation to the perishing world. Its return is always accompanied with pleasing recollections for a Merry Christmas, a term familiar to the infantile ear, and those who in mature years do not regard it as a religious festival and honor it with a sincere sense of sacred joy for the incalculable blessings it annually brings to view. Hail it for the day of rest and hilarity, withdraw from toil and labor of secular pursuits, and devote their leisure hours to friendly converse and deeds of benevolence. So here it is again, not a deeply religious holiday, but rather again cemented in the family, benevolence, charitable giving, and being with those you're close to. But I think it's amazing to think back that it's just in 1852 that the Providence Journal needs to publish an explanation of how to celebrate Christmas. So still seeing the role of the press and the role of print in telling people how to celebrate our holidays. So the Providence Journal, like many newspapers of the time, goes farther. And in 1852, in this first year where it's a holiday, they publish Christmas books and games. So here's a little ad that you can see here. Some of what they're showing is the new and interesting game of Uncle Tom and Little Eva, a game based on Uncle Tom's Cabin, which came out in March of that year. They're also recommending great gifts and books for purchase, including books called The Home Circle, The Book of the Heart, Homes of America. So again, really, it's hearth, it's home, and several books of poetry. The only other book that they call out is the highly prized illustrated Uncle Tom's Cabin. So I think that, again, really focusing on this is how you celebrate, and this is what you even should be getting for people. And they go so far as to, again, give you some gift ideas. And Clement C. Moore, in 1844, writes another poem. He publishes a book of poetry called Poems. And one of them is called Old Santa Claus. So this is 1844, but again, teaching people what to do. And he says, as Santa Claus, wherever I found good girls or boys that hated quarrels, strife, and noise, I left an apple or a tart, a wooden gun or painted cart. To some I gave a pretty doll, to some a peg top or a ball. No crackers, cannons, squibs, or rockets to blow their eyes up or their pockets. No drums to stun the mother's ear, nor swords to make their sisters fear, but pretty books to store their mind with knowledge of each various kind. But where I found the children naughty, in manners rude, in temper haughty, thankless to parents, liars, swearers, boxers, or cheats, or base tale bearers, I left a long black birchen rod, such as the dread command of God directs a parent's hand to use when virtue's path his son refuse. So here we see he's telling you the kinds of gifts you should be giving, how we should be doing this. And we see in our newspapers, before the advent of huge advertising sections for toy stores and what we're used to, they're really telling people what you should be looking for and what you should be giving to your loved ones. And again, they are also taking the time to publish poems like Fallon's to tell people about how to celebrate the season. And these are all, years ago, getting these off of microfilm. Now, soon, our access to these newspapers in the Providence Journal, but these other newspapers, so much easier now to find these incredible treasures to help us understand the evolution of our holidays and our traditions. And some of the other ways that we do is through art. And this, we often think about how the concepts of things like White Christmas, but the role that these authors played, but also the role that was played by people like Courier Knives and organizations like that, that are making these beautiful engravings and showing us these romanticized images, often of New England, of sleighs, of snow-covered hills, and that go and match songs like Jingle Bells that aren't necessarily about Christmas, but they're about winter. And they project these idealized images. And Christmas Eve here is actually an engraving by Thomas Nast. And Thomas Nast is, surprise, a German immigrant who arrives in the 1850s. And he begins as a staff illustrator at Harper's Weekly. And so Harper's Weekly is providing political news and commentary on national and international events, but also has sentimental fiction, humor, cultural news. And Nest begins to make these really beautiful prints connecting the Civil War, Christmas, and the sense of longing and family and nostalgia. And so it is Nast who sort of starts positioning the war and Christmas very clearly. But then he goes a little bit farther. And in 1863, he is the person who draws the Saint Nick, the Santa Claus that we so frequently think of. So here are some examples of I think the one on the right being so quintessentially sort of that Santa Claus figure. And he also has, the reindeer pulling the sleigh and sacks of presents. And so works on the bearded visage, the round belly, and really this kind of sprightly elf. And he was very clearly and unabashedly using Christmas and using Santa Claus as propaganda that was supporting abolition, that was supporting civil rights, and supporting at that time the Republican Party. And so even after the end of the Civil War, he frequently put Santa Claus into political cartoons and political imagery, and very much saw, again, the use of Christmas as a way of teaching about benevolence and charity. So, so we see here, again, the role of Germans, but also the way in which the press is really telling us how to celebrate and what to do. And I just wanted to also show you a couple things I recently found, and that is, while the English were sharing Christmas cards in the early part of the 19th century, they weren't hugely popular, and they weren't catching on here. It was not until we had the work of a man named Louis Prang, surprisingly, a German immigrant who came to Massachusetts and was he was a skilled engraver, and he was making business cards and very floral imagery, and was very well respected. And he, perhaps apocryphal story, that he went to one of the large expositions and he saw beautiful Christmas drawings. And he came back to his factory in Roxbury, and he began creating these Christmas cards. And in fact, it did not take long for them to catch on. And within 2 years, he was printing more than 5 million Christmas cards per year. So there was a huge appetite. We can see one of his earliest cards on the left, and then one from the 20th century on the right. He had a number of plants in Roxbury, then Springfield and Haverhill. And in fact, one of his largest companies was bought out and became American Crayon, which is Dixon, Ticonderoga, the people who make the pencils. And so this is the legacy of that company. But that Christmas card imagery that we see really is around 1880 that it starts to become truly popular. When I started this out, it really wasn't thinking about print culture and the way that the press and print influences, but it shouldn't be a surprise that it's through authors and poetry and art that we get these images. It was just a surprise to me a bit when I started this work on how much that activity centered in the 19th century and how much creation was involved about how we see and imagine Christmas. Here are just a couple shots from 1889 for some, also from our collection of the Christmas bells, and seeing these happy, beautiful children, the hearth and the home and the New England setting. For those Rhode Islanders here, you'll also enjoy seeing the Providence Bryant and Stratton Business College ad down here at the bottom. But by 1890, Christmas really looks the way we expect it to look. It has the same tenets that we see and that carry into the 20th and 21st century. And in Rhode Island, like everywhere in the United States, we also have within that mix the incredible traditions that other groups have brought in. And so these are just a few of my favorites, and from some significant groups that moved to Rhode Island. So within Cape Verde, there are huge fireworks displays, not just on New Year's, but actually on Christmas. And so it's very much a beach-centered holiday, and fireworks are part of the very public celebrations. And you can see this really lovely tropical nativity scene. We have a significant Italian population. And in fact, that nativity scene is very much kind of a defining characteristic of much of Italy, and made popular by St. Francis of Assisi. And so the city of Naples, in fact, is world famous for its nativity scenes. And you can go there and visit some that involve not just the characters we're used to, but sometimes up to 300 ancillary characters in these entire nativity villages. But they also, continuing with some of the German and Austrian traditions, but taking it out to the Epiphany. There's a picture at the top of your screen of La Befana, which is an old Italian Christmas tradition dating back to the 13th century. It is celebrated on the 6th of January, so the day of the Epiphany. And so on the night of January 5th, La Befana travels on her magic broom to every house in Italy, bringing gifts, climbing down chimneys, Sound familiar? She brings candy to the children that were good and black coal to the children who were naughty. The children used to leave, now kind of leave out stockings, and on the morning of January 6th, those stockings would be filled with candy. And children would leave out food and wine for her. So instead of that Santa Claus tradition, we have in certain traditional Italian communities, La Befana. Our French Canadian population has many Christmas traditions like the meat pie, but are perhaps most celebrated the bûche de Noël. So this beautiful rolled sponge cake that is, again, made to look like this log, which is a rural tradition that was used in France as well as in French Canada and is still made traditionally today. In Poland, the Wigilia is the main meal of the Christmas Eve with the family. And so what's interesting here is that there's always an extra set of silverware, which is, again, a tradition that we see in other cultures in case there's an unexpected guest. And on Christmas Eve, the unexpected guest is Jesus. And so people are prepared to invite him and leave an empty seat at the table. So we see this again in Jewish traditions. So the Wigilia features 12 meatless dishes in remembrance of the 12 apostles. And the meals are meatless because the animals are given the night off since they were there at the birth. So they were busy. So they have meatless meals for the day. And then one at the bottom picture here, I think is quite lovely. So in Colombia, Little Candles Day is celebrated on December 7th. So the eve of the Immaculate Conception, and it marks the beginning of the Christmas holiday in Colombia. So on windowsills and balconies, decorating parks and roads, Bogota closes several streets so its citizens can admire the Christmas lights. And it is considered some of the largest and most beautiful light spectacles in the world. And so that whole Advent period in Colombia is some of the most extraordinary light displays you can find anywhere. And we also know that we have an early population and a population that grew dramatically in the 20th century, a Jewish population here in Rhode Island. And so, of course, now we know that we celebrate Hanukkah, and that has started last week. But interestingly, again, Hanukkah is not a particularly religious holiday in the way that Yom Kippur, Rosh Hashanah, even Passover are. Its proximity to Christmas has made it also very popular to have also in December, but I think its central tenets also showing the effect of light and the importance of candles, the traditions that are very similar, not just in gift giving, but in the importance of what these other winter celebrations are and the need for light and the need for food and for safety that came up in those early celebrations we would even see in Saturnalia. And so all of these traditions that are ongoing in Rhode Island and America that have fed into and informed and layered upon that 19th century concept of Christmas that we've been chatting about. So I hope you learned something. I hope you enjoyed a little, and I hope that you all have a wonderful holiday season. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask. Thank you.
Thanks, Morgan. Yeah, that was great. Everyone's clapping, I can see. Thank you. Yeah, so if anyone has any questions, they can raise their hand and I'll unmute you. You can type it in the chat and I'll relay, but we do have one question from early on in the chat that we can start with. Marie M asks, what's the origination of the name Saturnalia?
As far as I know, it has to do with Saturn. I wish I could tell you more than that. This is really not my area. But as far as I know, it just has to be the celebration of the sun, but it clearly has to do with something astronomical.
Yeah.
These are my areas of profound weakness. If you have questions about prison, I'm your girl.
There you go.
And certainly, if anyone has any wonderful or terrifying Christmas traditions to share, I gave this talk years ago, 2008, or a version of it at Laurel Mead. And it was a really wonderful day. And I noticed at one point a gentleman crying. And I went up to him afterwards, and it was because, in fact, he had grown up in a very German community in Pennsylvania, and that still actually had the Belsnickel. And he had not thought about it since he was a little boy. And he was so terrified of it, but he was also really excited to hear about it, because he said sometimes he thought he'd been imagining it, because it was just so terrifying.
Let's see. It doesn't look like we have any questions right now or comments.
I have a
Germany,
question.
in
there we
Germany,
go.
did you ever experience, Sylvia, the beatings?
I did.
Yes, they had Nadia. She did. No, we did celebrate Saint Nick, and yes, I didn't have any beatings, but I did end up with coal in my stocking on the 6th of December here and there. So coal, and then I also did get the oranges and the sweets. So I wasn't all bad.
I wanted to ask what drew you to research this topic in such depth?
I think, again, some of it was hearing about the outlawing and wanting to understand the outlawing of it in the Puritan realm. And then I just thought it was fascinating, especially the way in which it was so invented. And I think about, many of us have been alive long enough to think about other holidays that have been created, and people being so critical of the creation of holidays and how, well, you don't create holidays. And in fact, what was interesting to me was watching and seeing that, in fact, we do create holidays and we do invent these traditions. And so thinking about the role that is played in the construction of any of our cultural practices as really one that involves agency and involves choice, for things especially that seem like they've been around forever. And so I thought Christmas was particularly interesting to me. I enjoy Christmas as a cultural spectacle, and it definitely was that. It was a very food and family based holiday to me. And so it just was curious. I do see, I'm a little afraid of this, but I do see that my father has a question. Hold on, he has to unmute himself. Or Chris, can you unmute him?
Yeah, let me try to unmute him here.
Chris will unmute you, Dad.
Looks like I can ask him to unmute himself. He might have to click on something. Something might have just popped up. There we go.
There you
Yep.
go.
A gentleman named John Longstaff in 1957 started a tradition at Harvard of the Christmas revels. And I believe they're still being held for the 2 weeks preceding Christmas. Do you know how that corresponds to the Feast of Fools, which occurs during the week after Christmas, where you have 3 big religious events until the Feast of the Epiphany? You have St. Stephen's, the first martyr. You have St. John the Baptist's birthday, and you have the Feast of the Circumcision.
Yeah.
Which is usually where the kind of reveling occurs within the church itself. And you have that role reversal where the altar boys become the priests, the ass is brought into the church with a false pope, which is being played by a deacon, and the priests get to serve the mass, and sausages are put out on the altar instead of the host. Do you know of any kind of relationship, or why one is done before Christmas and one is done after, or are they just 2 completely separate different events?
Sorry, we're getting a vote to revive the Feast of the Circumcision. I don't know. I think that some of it has to do with, again, sort of who's constructing the holiday and around what's Protestant and what's Catholic. But certainly the Catholic influence that in the 20th century were able and people are more comfortable to bring in ways that in the 19th century were rejected. There are certain cultures that simply have, like in Colombia, that have focused on the, the kind of Annunciation forward rather than the day of Christmas to the Epiphany. But I'm not sure as to why that distinction is made in some cultures rather than others. Certainly within English tradition, which I would assume that many people at Harvard are looking at both English and German, the focus is typically between Christmas Day and Twelfth Night. But I don't know. I would also think that there is a possibility at places like American universities where it is simply focused on when they are actually in session and when they're actually on campus. I mean, I hate to be that practical, but it was the 50s. So. And I see too that Phoebe had experienced some anthracite gifts in Scranton, Pennsylvania. Beautiful downtown Scranton. Feast of the Fools perhaps has to do with final exams, a suggestion from Luther, a scholar of higher education. And so an interesting idea, and feel free to speak up. This is part of our holiday revels. So I want everyone to feel free to chime in and
Yes, yeah.
chat and talk.
Everyone can unmute themselves now.
Yeah,
So if you have a comment,
so
feel
crazy.
free. Yeah.
Good night, Ruth. Thank you for coming. Ruth, for those of you who don't know, is the executive director of the Newport Historical Society, who's joining us tonight.
I thought everyone got real coal in their stocking.
I don't think I ever got any coal. I've seen candy coal.
No, big chunk of anthracite.
Wow.
It's cold country out there.
Yeah.
So I think Morgan went above and beyond by arranging the snow for this evening for everyone. I know it's snowing where I am.
Well, we're waiting. We've got a foot of snow or so coming. And sadly, no snow days for anyone anymore. But I thank you all for joining us tonight. And I look forward to sharing more holidays and holiday cheer with all of you, even if virtually. So thank you all. And Liz, do you have any parting words for folks?
I just want to thank everyone for spending their time with us this evening. And we'll send you a follow-up email in the morning with some introductory offers for membership if you're not already a member. So thank you again, and I hope you have a wonderful holiday and that there is no Krampus.
Yes, I wish you a Christmas free of beatings.
Yes.
Thank you very much. This was fun.
Yeah.
Thanks.
This was great.
Bye.
Thanks,
Thank you
everyone.
all.
Good night, everyone.
Night,
Good
everyone.
night. Thank you.